The Mexican government certainly treating the recent negotiations in Washington as a win, telling the crowd here today that they will provide humanitarian aid for the migrants as they make their way through Mexico, but also saying that they left the negotiations with their dignity intact, and that's the message they wanted to convey to their audience today. President Andrés Manuel López Obrador took the stage in front of thousands of supporters as he declared victory following negotiations with the United States. He called it a rally for dignity and said Mexicans should be proud of the outcome.
La semana próxima.
Starting next week, humanitarian aid, employment opportunities, education, and health care will be offered to those who want asylum and are waiting to legally cross into the United States. López Obrador described himself as a pacifist who did not want to fight the U.S. or American citizens, yet he also needed to show political strength for his new administration. Some economists feared the tariffs could cause Mexico to plunge into a recession. They would have especially hurt Baja California's car manufacturers who regularly ship parts across the border. Earlier this week, Mexico sent National Guard troops to help secure its southern border with Central American nations, as López Obrador told the crowd about the U.S.'s history of taking in migrants.
Y en otros momentos, Estados Unidos.
In other times, the U.S. has given refuge to important people in history. He went on to say Mexicans should be proud before singing the national anthem surrounded by leaders from across Mexico. López Obrador is shaking hands as he exits the stage here. He was warmly received by the people of Baja California and Tijuana and handily won the region when he campaigned here during the recent election. And people here understand the impacts of those tariffs certainly would have had on their community, and a lot of the shops in here, with economists saying it could have plunged the economy into a potential recession. And they are treating this certainly as a win today.